Hello, and welcome to OurVentura.com. I'm your host today, Frank James Malle, and in our studio we have renowned abstract pointillist Leonard Goldstein. Leonard, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Abstract pointillist.
Yes.
Pointillism.
Yes.
Tell me, what are we talking about here?
We're talking about a style of a painting that occurred probably around 1850 and 60. But before that, it came through to us through physics. Chevreul, a physicist, discovered that light broke up into fragments, and he did a lot of work on that. The Impressionists got hold of this and worked with it and turned it into art. So that's where you get the little dots in the Pointillism and the Impressionists and the Post-Impressionists and the Abstract Expressionists and the Abstraction. All that comes from that.
So when we say abstract and we say surreal and we say minimalist, are we talking basically the same thing?
No. No, abstract is an artist's interpretation of what he's viewing. In other words, if you take a landscape and somebody paints it, a fastidious landscape, and you think that that's real, but it's not. It's just a painting of something that somebody drew from. What's real is the mountain, not the painting. So everything is really an abstraction. Minimalism is another concept that comes later on, where you boil something down to its essence, a square, a cube, a round thing. It's got almost no data in it except its shape.
Now, I understand you began your art career as a young boy. At least your fascination with art began when you were 5 years old, I believe.
Yeah. I had a...
Can you tell us about that experience?
Yeah. I had a primal experience when I was very young. I was about 5. I was brought to a relative's home, my cousin, and she was studying sculpture at Columbia University, and she was working on a clay bust. And I thought this was incredible. I'd never seen anything like that before. I never, and I looked at it and I was astounded. I said to her, "Where did you get that?" And she said, "Oh, I made it." And I said, "You can make that? Somebody could make that?" And at that moment, I knew I could. Now, I don't know how I knew I could. I just knew. And ever since then, I was an artist.
Which brought you to the New York High School of Art and Design, I believe.
Correct.
And this was in the late 50s.
That's right.
And I understand that you were one of few students that were handpicked to help design the lower level of the George Washington Bridge. Now, that must have been
that was
quite an honor.
It was incredible. But I was studying architecture as my major in high school. This is a special school that you can learn advertising art, calligraphy, painting, all sorts of arts. It was dedicated just to that. I chose architecture because my father was a carpenter and I wanted to be better than him. So he respected architects and I went into that. And the teacher worked for Armin and Whitney, Irwin T. Muller, and they were doing the lower level of the George Washington Bridge. So he would bring the plans to school, and the people who had the most interest in the project and threw out ideas and stuff, they chose to come to the office and actually see how the plans were put together and stuff. I actually had never seen the George Washington Bridge, nor knew where it was at the time. But it was a phenomenal process, to see all that stuff going on. The interesting thing about it was at that point, the George Washington Bridge was the longest suspension bridge in the world. But they were now planning to build the Verrazano Narrows Bridge, which was 54 feet longer. And everybody in Armin and Whitney was ticked off by the fact that they were building a bridge bigger than the one they were working on.
I guess being from New York, you had an opportunity to visit all the museums.
Yes.
What was your first museum experience?
I was 12 years old. I went to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and I walked in. I was in awe of everything, and I found myself in a room with a painting by Salvatore Dali. It was of the crucifix, and it's the one where his wife is down at the bottom looking up, and it's suspended off the canvas, the Christ figure. is just projected into space. And I was so moved. I sat there for an hour looking at it. I actually cried. I don't know why, but I did. And it was a seminal moment in my art career, just sitting there, just soaking that in. It's an amazing event for me.
Now, this brings you to your phase when you moved out to the West, New Mexico.
Correct.
And you hooked up with artist John Chamberlain.
Correct.
And from there, you built a lifelong friendship.
Well, you know, for the time we were together in New York, we were friends. But outside of that, you know, I was a young man at the time and very insecure and not too sure of myself, especially in the art world, because I didn't really have the vocabulary or the gravitas, as it were, to defend myself in that environment. And so I kind of like, you know, played rope-a-dope and stepped back. But I was there, you know, I was blessed with a pleasing personality. And so, I was able to get by. But, you have contacts and they come and go.
Well, speaking of contacts, while you were living in New York, I believe it was down in Lower Manhattan?
Soho.
You had an incredible loft.
Oh, well, everybody did. Everybody did. I had 3,000 square feet for $90 a month. And this was while we were still on the gold standard. So all you had to do as an artist was work for 2 weeks out of the month and you were king. Yeah, everything was great. So, and this was at 98 Green Street. And it was an incredible era. It was an incredible time. It was like Athens must have been when Aristotle and Plato and all these people were walking around formulating what we know as Western culture and Western philosophy. That's what was happening in Soho.
So you got to meet all the inner circle of the abstract art world.
Yes, I did. Yeah.
And that would include Andy Warhol and Yoko Ono. And can you elaborate on some other people?
And Jasper Johns, Frank Stella. These were all friends of Chamberlain's. And so because I didn't really know anybody in New York at that point, I would just kind of like tail around with him. I did a couple of pieces for him for his studio. I didn't do them. I worked with him on them, and I was his assistant for quite a while when he was doing the Radical Sculpture series.
What was the Radical Sculpture series?
It was a kind of I don't know if you know John's work, but it was kind of like a minimal aspect of the work that he had been doing up until that point. It was not painted. It was silver, like aluminum duct kind of things, but made into the shapes that he preferred. And so, it was kind of like a laid back Chamberlain, if you will.
Let me ask you a question.
Sure.
As someone who goes to museums, when I come to abstract art, I'm at a loss. I don't know what to look for. I don't know whether I'm supposed to try to look for the psychological meaning or look for the colors or, sometimes you just don't, quote, get it. What does one look for when one's looking at abstract art? I mean, what should the approach be?
Well, the first thing is that all art is abstract art. Like I said before, if you paint a mountain, what you just painted is not real. It's an abstraction. The word abstract means to draw from. So you're drawing from your experience of your perceptions. And that's exactly what you're doing. You're perceiving something and you have an experience of it and you're transferring it to a canvas. That's not real. The mountain is real. The painting is an abstraction. So if you can follow that and work with that, then whenever you look at anything, you know how to kind of look at it because therefore you have your perceptions and you have your viewpoint and you bring to it what the artist has embedded in it. That's the trick. The art is the communication. If you make a painting, it's just a painting. If it's not communicating, it's still just a painting.
So if there's no connection, if there's no communication, in other words, if the person viewing the art piece doesn't, quote, get it?
Right.
Is it then still art?
Well, it depends. You have to know a little bit about it. For instance, a lot of people talk about Jackson Pollock and his paintings. And anybody can throw paint at a canvas. Well, up until Jackson Pollock came along, nobody threw paint at a canvas.
What about Andy Warhol with the urine spill or whatever painting that he has?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of that stuff. That's less of a stretch than Pollock. I think Pollock was a greater artist than Warhol was. Warhol was more commercial, and he was using that. He was taking the commercial world and bringing it into the art world, whereas Pollock was taking the art world and pushing it further. And when you understand, there's one painting, I can't remember the name of it, it's in the Australian Museum. It's a very famous Jackson Pollock, and it's this crazy field, and then he's got these lines in it. And what it is the combination of randomity and stability in one. In other words, he took the yin and the yang and put it together. He made a complete wholeness of it. And once you understand what he was doing, then you can get it. If you don't understand it.
One of the most fascinating aspects of your art in my research was the psychic warrior shields that you developed. Can you tell us how those came about?
Those came about from listening to Joseph Campbell. And Joseph Campbell talked about an African tribe and what happens when somebody dies. And when somebody dies, they cut a tree down, they put the body on the tree, and everybody who knew that person would come along and carve or paint or do something to the log. And then at a certain moment, they would embellish it in whatever way they were going to do that, and then they'd set it afire and cremate the whole thing, and it would turn into smoke and go into the heaven. This was their concept of the life cycle, from life to death to rebirth. And so in the smoke, and I saw that as one of the origins of art. I said, oh, wow, look at that. These people are communicating. His ex-wife came along and chopped up on the tree, and she did something on the tree. This was her, communication to him, maybe withheld.
Well, let's take a look at some of these psychic shields, if you
Sure.
will. And the first one we're going to be looking at is called the Shield of Moe.
Correct.
And this represents what?
This represents the working out of this kind of idea that I just was addressing with Joseph Campbell. It's a way of bringing materialism and the spirit world together. That's why I use the dots, because the dots they're not solid. They move around. Every time you look at them, you perceive them differently. So it has that aspect to it. And the whole idea of all my work is to try and bring together the spiritual aspect of humans and the physical aspect of humans, which are two completely and separate things. It's the spirit that animates the body and the mind. It's where all your thoughts come from, where all your ideas come from, where art comes from. It comes from the spirit world, not from a body that came out of a puddle of mud that was struck by lightning that was filled with ammonia. That's not life.
And the next shield we have is called the Shield of Accretion.
Yes.
And this represents...
This is a later in the series. This series started in about 1990. And it had to do with my research into actual shields. I went back and I looked at some shields that were 1,000 years old in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And I said, oh my God, these are modern. This is Ellsworth Kelly with a shield, So I started, using some of the older motifs and putting them together. The Shield of Accretion is the bringing together of two separate parts into a new whole.
Now, running out of time, so I want to give you a chance to tell the viewers where they can find more information about your life and work.
You can go to my website, LeonardGoldstein.com. That's LeonardGoldstein.com. And you can communicate with me through it. You can view many pieces of work from 1965 until right now. And that's the best way to reach me.
Terrific. For OurVentura.com, I'm your host, Frank James Malle. Thanks for joining us today.